How America Remains Divided on Gun Control. Introduction. Guns have been part of American society for a long time. They have been used for various purposes as part of sports, and some use them for hunting. However, in the last few decades, there have been so many questions raised on whether guns should be left out for the access of everybody or whether there should be control over their possession. It is notable that the United States experiences about 35,000 deaths every year, and about half the families in America own at least one gun. Gun control problem. The Second Amendment is part of the founding documents of the United States Constitution. The ratification of this law was aimed at denying the citizens the right of being in possession of guns. The result of this led to the presence of culture wars between the supporters of gun control and the individuals who were against it. Since the 19th century, federal laws have always impinged on the right of citizens or the ability to own weapons. The ratification of the 14 Amendments in 1868 required the state and local authorities to follow the Fundamental Bill of Rights. However, in the decades after the Civil War, the Supreme Court did not mention whether the Second Amendment restricts the actions of the states or local authorities. The High Court address on the Second Amendment after the 14th Amendment was in place brought a contradiction to the 14th Amendment ratifiers, as they resolved that the Second Amendment did not constrict state actions. Until the National Firearms Act of 1934, there were no federal acts that affected the right to keep or bear guns. The past 50 years have seen a substantial number of laws aimed at restricting the use of guns at federal, state, and local levels. A movement by the name Gun Control Movement has been launched with the sole aim of controlling the possession of guns, as they view them as instruments of crime rather than a part of cultural heritage and a vital tool of human right for self-defense. The issue also caught the attention of the state houses and Congress due to the increase in crime in the 1960s. However, in the case of United States v. Heller, the High Court made a ruling that favored the people who were in support of having guns. It was at this point that the complexity of the matter was noted, as no one knew how the decision by the High Court would impact the decision to restrict the availability of guns to citizens. However, it was in another case law, that the federal case of appeal in the case of United States v. Emerson, that the Court of Appeal determined that the Second Amendment indeed protected the right to keep and bear arms. Though the Supreme Court was clear, other lower courts have made decisions contrary to this regarding the Second Amendment. The decision in the Emerson case brought infuriation to the people who opposed the move to have guns in possession of the people. The outcome of this was the case by a group of lawyers led by Levy that was opposed to the Second Amendment ruling. The case that was filed in 2003 had an initial victory with partial defeat, and finally a loss. The result was not a surprising one, since the culture of having guns among the American public has always been there from the time the Constitution was drafted. Through the years, there have always been various campaigners for laws that should be put in place to control guns. The proponents of gun control have always insisted on having background checks for the people who are in possession of guns. One of the campaigners, Sarah Brady, was even quoted campaigning for an extension of the ban on selling rifles to other people except the police in 2004. The arguments against ownership of guns find their basis of arguments on the statistics regarding the number of firearms violence experienced in the United States every day. According to Crooker, the number of deaths experienced in the 1990s shows that about 30,000 people die every year due to gunshots, and about half of these deaths are due to suicide. The cost of a gunshot is not just emotional but also has an economic effect. The cost of treating a gunshot wound is very expensive, and it ranges from $150,000 to $200,000. The problems do not end there, as they extend also to domestic violence. A study carried out in 1994 showed that 68% of domestic violence homicides were caused due to having firearms. Another study also showed that a home with a gun also has a 5 times greater likelihood to experience incidences of violence than a gun-free home. On the other hand, proponents of having guns available to the citizens find their basis of argument in the fact that there exists a right of self-defense, and the need to overthrow a tyrannical government as well as defend the nation in case of a foreign invasion. The right of self-defense is also argued that the right to self-defense should rest on society and not a single individual. the issue of self-defense is both practical and moral. The practical arguments rest on whether one should be prepared to injure or kill to protect oneself. It is therefore wise for one to avoid having the firearm if he is not able to defend himself with it in case of an attack, as the attacker may take it from him. On moral arguments, it is deemed that the moral objection to violence is recognized by the government. Issues of self-defense are arguable to the circumstances that existed when instances of injury or death occurred. Conclusion. The question of being in possession of guns is a right granted in the Constitution to the American people. The fact that various reasons have led to issues of whether there needs to be gun control needs to be substantially addressed. Since it might be hard to take guns from the people, there is a need to ensure that the guns are only held by responsible citizens.